On the first Monday of every month, in a prosperous household in Belgravia, the servants were weighed, not measured for new uniforms, not assessed by a physician for their health, weighed, on a large platform scale that sat in the corridor between the housekeeper's parlour and the kitchen, a scale of the kind used in the household's laundry for measuring quantities of linen. Each servant stepped onto the scale in turn. The housekeeper recorded the number in a dedicated column in her management ledger. The number was compared to the previous month's number. If the number had increased, if a servant weighed more than she had weighed 4 weeks earlier, the housekeeper made a note. If the increase exceeded a threshold that the household's employer had specified, the servant was called into the housekeeper's parlour for what the ledger describes, in the careful language of Victorian household management, as a dietary consultation. The dietary consultation was not a consultation, it was a reduction of the servant's already inadequate food allocation. She had gained weight in a household that fed its servants inadequately by any nutritional standard, in a kitchen full of food that she was not permitted to eat. She had somehow gained weight, and the household's response was to give her less. Her name was Ellen Marsh. She was 22 years old. She was a housemaid in this Belgravia household. She had been in service since she was 15. She weighed, on the first Monday of February, 1879, 8 stone and 2 pounds, a weight that a modern physician would classify as underweight for a woman of her height, performing the level of physical labor that her duties required. The household classified it as excessive. The dietary consultation reduced her daily bread allocation by 1/3. Ellen Marsh went to bed that night with less food than she had woken up with that morning, because she weighed 8 stone and 2 pounds in a house full of food she could not eat. I have spent 15 documentaries on this channel documenting what Victorian domestic service did to the people who performed it. I have documented the hunger, the sleeplessness, the surveillance, the locked larders, and the counted tea leaves and the dismissed for a cold potato. Tonight is different from all of those. Tonight we are not documenting a system that accidentally produced hunger as a byproduct of indifference. Tonight we are documenting a system that actively monitored its servants' bodies to ensure they were not consuming too much of the food they were surrounded by. Active, deliberate. Recorded in ledgers. This is the gilded trace. The weighing of domestic servants was not universal in Victorian England. It was not a formal requirement of any household management system. It did not appear as a recommendation in Mrs. Beeton's book of household management, which addressed the question of servant food with the language of allocation and management, but did not, in its published editions, explicitly advocate weighing servants as a monitoring mechanism. But it happened in a number of documented households, primarily large, well-staffed establishments in London and the major provincial cities, primarily in the middle decades of the Victorian period. The weighing of servants was a regular practice, conducted monthly or weekly, and recorded in the household's administrative documents with the same bureaucratic thoroughness applied to every other aspect of the household's management. The practice had its roots in a broader Victorian anxiety about servant dishonesty, specifically the specific form of dishonesty that the household manuals call pilfering, and that we have examined in previous documentaries as the entirely rational behavior of hungry people surrounded by food they were not permitted to eat. We know from our earlier documentary on the leftover food system that Victorian households were acutely aware of the gap between the food that passed through their kitchens and the food that reached the family's table. They were aware that servants supplemented their inadequate allocations by various means: the reused tea leaves, the bread heel pocketed during the clearing of the dinner service, the cold potato eaten in the kitchen when the housekeeper's back was turned. They were aware of it. And some of them decided to find a way to measure it. The logic of the weighing practice was this: if a servant's weight increased beyond what her official allocation should produce, the increase represented evidence of additional consumption. Additional consumption represented theft from the household's provisions. The weight gain was, in the household's framework, the physical record of the pilfering. The logic was not medically sound. Human weight fluctuates for many reasons that have nothing to do with food consumption, hydration, hormonal changes, the specific timing of the weighing relative to meals and sleep. A servant who weighed a pound more than she had the previous month had not necessarily eaten a pound of unauthorized food. But the households that adopted this practice were not approaching it as a medical question. They were approaching it as a management question. And the management answer was, if the weight is up, reduce the allocation. Thomas Hughes, no relation to the many other Thomases in this series, was the employer in the Belgravia household where Ellen Marsh was weighed. His household management notes, which survive in a private archive that a researcher brought to public attention in the 1990s, are among the most complete records we have of the internal rationale behind the weighing practice. He wrote, "The temptation available to servants in a well-provisioned household is considerable, and the practical supervision of every individual act of consumption is impossible. A regular accounting of each servant's physical condition provides a reliable indirect measure of consumption that direct supervision cannot achieve." A reliable indirect measure of consumption. He was describing the human body as a measuring instrument. His servants' bodies were data points in an accounting system. The household management ledger kept by the housekeeper in Thomas Hughes's Belgravia establishment is one of the most extraordinary documents to emerge from the research for tonight's documentary. It runs to 3 volumes covering the period 1874 to 1886. Each volume is meticulously maintained. The kind of record that reflects a housekeeper of considerable professional competence, someone who understood her role as a managerial one and who approached its documentation with the thoroughness of a person who expected the records to be reviewed. They were reviewed. Hughes reviewed them quarterly. His annotations appear throughout in a different hand from the housekeeper's: queries, approvals, occasional instructions. The weight columns, 1 per servant, updated on the first Monday of each month, run through all 3 volumes. 12 years of monthly weighings for a household that at various times employed between 8 and 14 servants. 12 years. The pattern that emerges from those columns, when you read them in aggregate rather than entry by entry, is one of the most disturbing things the research for this series has produced. The weights do not, across those 12 years, show a steady maintenance or gradual increase of the kind you would expect in a healthy, adequately fed person. They show something different, something that maps with uncomfortable precision onto what we know about the physiological consequences of chronic undernutrition combined with demanding physical labor. In the first year of each servant's employment, the weights typically decrease. A servant who arrives at the household having previously been in a different position, or having spent a period between positions, arrives with a body that reflects whatever nutrition she received before. Within the first months of employment in the Hughes household, her weight falls. This is the body responding to the reduction in nutritional provision that the household's allocation represents. The body is receiving less than it was before. The weight reflects this honestly. By the second or third year, the weight stabilized, not at a healthy level, but at whatever reduced level the household's allocation sustains. The body has adapted, it has adjusted its baseline, it is managing in the specific physiological sense of running below adequate provision without immediately collapsing. And then occasionally, perhaps once every 18 months, perhaps less frequently, a weight increases, not dramatically, a pound, sometimes 2. The kind of increase that might reflect a few additional pieces of bread eaten over the course of a month, or the reused tea leaves that the kitchen maid had been stretching, or the cold potato taken during the clearing of a dinner service. And the ledger records it, and Hughes annotates it, and the housekeeper is instructed, and the allocation is reduced. The body that was already below adequate provision is given less. The weight in the following month falls back, and the cycle continues, 12 years, entry by entry, month by month. The camera of Thomas Hughes's weighing practice recording, in numbered columns, the slow consumption of the people who maintained his household. Ellen Marsh has been in the historical record for 20 years, since the researcher who found the Hughes household ledgers identified her as the servant whose story the ledgers told most completely. She entered the Hughes household in 1876 when she was 19 years old. She had previously been in service in a household in Kensington. Her references from that position are in the ledger, transcribed in the housekeeper's hand, and describe her as an excellent housemaid of good character and strong constitution. Strong constitution. By the time the housekeeper wrote those words, Ellen's constitution was 3 years into a process of systematic reduction that the weighing columns document with the precision of a scientific record. She weighed 9 stone and 4 pounds on her first weighing in the Hughes household in October 1876. This was her starting weight, the weight of a 19-year-old woman who had been in service for 4 years, but whose previous household had apparently fed her more adequately than the one she was about to enter. By October 1877, 1 year later, she weighed 8 stone and 11 pounds. She had lost 7 pounds in her first year. The ledger does not comment on this. Weight loss was not flagged, weight gain was flagged. A servant who weighed less than before was a servant who was not pilfering. The direction of the change was satisfactory. By October 1878, 2 years in, she weighed 8 stone and 6 pounds. Another 5 pounds lost. Still no annotation from Hughes, still no comment from the housekeeper. The loss was in the correct direction. And then February 1879. The month we began with, the month Ellen weighed 8 stone and 2 pounds, and the ledger annotated it as an increase from her January weighing, the first increase in over 2 years of steady decline. The increase was 4 ounces. 4 ounces. The dietary consultation reduced her bread allocation by a third, 4 ounces. In a body that had already lost nearly a stone in 2.5 years of service. In a body that a modern physician would classify as underweight at 8 stone 2. In a body performing the sustained physical labor of a full-time housemaid in a large Belgravia establishment, 4 ounces gained, a third of the bread allocation removed. Ellen Marsh remained in the Hughes household until 1882. Her final recorded weight in the ledger's last entry for her is 7 stone and 9 pounds. She had arrived weighing 9 stone and 4 pounds. She left for reasons the ledger does not record, though the Maby's charity records show she came to them for assistance shortly after, weighing 7 stone and 9 pounds. 19 pounds lighter than when she had arrived. In 6 years, she was 25 years old. The weighing of Victorian servants did not go entirely unexamined by the medical profession. Several Victorian physicians who worked with servant populations, through hospital work, through charity medicine, through the kind of social investigation that produced the documented cases we draw on throughout this series, encountered the weighing practice and wrote about it with the varying degrees of directness that the period's professional culture permitted. Dr. James Edmonds, a London physician who published in the medical journals of the 1870s on the health of domestic servants, addressed the weighing practice in one of his published papers with the careful language of a man who understood what he was criticizing and who also understood the social constraints on how directly he could criticize it. He wrote that the practice of monitoring servants' weights as a proxy for food consumption reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of human physiology, and that the use of weight reduction as a response to perceived overconsumption in a population already exhibiting signs of nutritional inadequacy was likely to produce outcomes directly contrary to the household's interests in maintaining a functional workforce. Likely to produce outcomes directly contrary to the household's interests. He was not arguing, primarily, that it was inhumane. He was arguing that it was ineffective. That the servants whose weights were reduced were servants whose physical capacity was reduced, and that a household that reduced the physical capacity of its servants was a household that would get less work from them. He was trying to reach the households that the moral argument had failed to reach. He was trying to make the economic argument. He was not, by the evidence available to us, particularly successful. Dr. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, one of the first women to qualify as a physician in England, and a woman whose medical practice brought her into sustained contact with the health problems of working-class women, was more direct. She described the weighing practice in correspondence with a colleague as the medical equivalent of monitoring the fuel gauge of a machine while simultaneously reducing its fuel supply, and then expressing surprise when the machine began to malfunction. The medical equivalent of monitoring the fuel gauge while reducing the fuel supply. She was describing with the compressed precision of someone who understood both the physiology and the absurdity exactly what Thomas Hughes's ledger columns showed. The measure was accurate. The response to the measure was the exact opposite of what the measure indicated was needed. The machine was running out of fuel. The household saw the gauge move and took fuel away. Ellen Marsh arrived at the Hughes household weighing 9 stone and 4 pounds. She left 6 years later weighing 7 stone and 9 pounds, 19 pounds lighter. 25 years old, 4 ounces gained in February 1879 resulted in a reduction of 1/3 of her bread allocation. 4 ounces in a body already losing weight every year, in a house full of food she was not permitted to eat. If this is sitting with you, if the ledger columns and the weight loss and the dietary consultation are sitting with you, subscribe to the Gilded Trace. Every subscriber tells YouTube that these hidden histories matter, that the Ellen Marshes of Victorian England deserve to have their stories told to more people than were in the room when it happened. Stay with me, because we haven't yet talked about the other households, the ones who took the practice further than Hughes did, and the women whose stories those ledgers tell. The Hughes household is the most completely documented case of the servant weighing practice that the historical record preserves, but it is not the only one. The research for tonight's documentary has identified references to similar practices in at least 6 other households across the Victorian period, references that range from the detailed, a second set of household ledgers discovered in a regional archive that maintain weight records for a Manchester household between 1868 and 1874, to the fragmentary, a reference in a charity caseworker's notes, to a former servant describing a weighing practice in the household where she had been employed without identifying the household by name. Each case is different in its specific details, but together they suggest that the practice was more widespread than any single set of documents would imply. that what the Hughes ledgers preserved so completely was a version of something that operated less formally or less completely documented in a number of Victorian households. The Manchester household ledgers, which cover a household of 11 servants across 6 years, show a pattern similar to the Hughes records, though the weighing was conducted fortnightly rather than monthly, and the threshold for intervention was lower. A servant who gained more than half a pound in a fortnight was subject to what these records call a review of provisions. A review of provisions for half a pound. In 6 years of records, there are 47 annotated reviews of provisions, 47 occasions on which a servant in this Manchester household was determined to have gained too much weight and had her food allocation reviewed as a result. 47 in 6 years in a household of 11 servants. The charity caseworker's notes, which cannot be precisely dated but appear to be from the 1880s, describe a former servant named simply as Agnes, who had been employed in a London household that weighed its servants weekly. Agnes described the weekly weighing as the most demoralizing aspect of her entire experience of service, not the hunger, not the cold, not the sleeplessness, the weighing. She described standing on the scale in her uniform, the housekeeper with her ledger, the number being written down. She described the way the housekeeper looked at the number before she wrote it. A specific kind of look, Agnes said, that told her immediately whether the consultation was coming. She described the particular quality of the consultation, the way the housekeeper delivered the news of the allocation reduction with the professional neutrality of someone performing an administrative function without apparent awareness that she was telling a hungry woman that she would receive less food. Agnes described trying to explain, briefly, carefully, because protest beyond a certain point was its own kind of risk in a service position, that she had not eaten anything she had not been given, that she did not know why her weight had increased, that she was, to the best of her knowledge, eating exactly what she was allocated. The housekeeper recorded this in the ledger as a denial of pilfering. The allocation was reduced regardless. Agnes left that household within the month. Her reference described her as a servant of adequate ability but difficult disposition. She had asked why her food was being reduced. She had explained that she had not stolen anything. She had left rather than continued to be weighed and found wanting in a household where the weighing was the point of greatest humiliation, in an experience that contained many points of humiliation. Difficult disposition. We have documented throughout this series what inadequate food did to Victorian servants' bodies. The fainting, the premature aging, the chronic conditions that accumulated across years of service and produced, in women who were often barely past 30, the physical presentations of much older people. The weighing practice added a specific dimension to this damage that is worth examining separately from the physical one. It is the psychological dimension. To stand on a scale in your uniform while someone else records the number and assesses it against a threshold you did not set and cannot appeal, and then tells you that the number indicates you have been consuming more than your allocation, and does this to you in the full knowledge that you have been hungry, is a specific kind of degradation. Not because the physical act of being weighed is inherently degrading, it is not, but because of what the act communicates in the context of the Victorian household's relationship with its servants, about the nature of the servant's body and the household's right to it. The weighing practice communicated this: your body is not yours. It is the household's instrument, the household's resource, the household's concern when it deviates from what the household considers appropriate. Your body's size and weight are data points in the household's management system. They will be measured. They will be compared. They will be managed. You will be managed. Ellen Marsh would have understood this without needing it explained. The monthly weighing across 6 years communicated it with regularity. Her body was not her private concern. It was a number in a column in a ledger that Thomas Hughes reviewed quarterly. And the number for 6 years went steadily down. The psychological literature on what happens to people whose bodies are subjected to sustained external monitoring and management, whose physical measurements are used as justification for controlling their access to food, describes outcomes that are, in their clinical terminology, deeply disturbing. The particular anxiety of someone who is always aware of being measured. The distorted relationship with food that develops when food is simultaneously a source of survival and a source of punishment, the erosion of the sense that one's body is one's own. Victorian servants did not have access to this literature, but they had their experience, and the experience, as Agnes described it to the charity caseworker, and as other accounts suggest was common among servants subjected to this practice, was one of the most corrosive aspects of the entire system. Not the worst thing done to Victorian servants, not even close, given everything this series has documented, but perhaps the most precise statement of what the system believed about the people it employed. Your body is data. Your hunger is a management problem. Your weight is our concern, not yours. Not everyone who encountered the Victorian servant weighing practice was silent about it. The social reformers who documented the lives of domestic servants in the latter decades of the Victorian period included in their accounts descriptions of the weighing practice that range from the careful to the frankly outraged. Louisa Twining, whose work with former servants gave her perhaps the most sustained and intimate knowledge of what service had done to the women she encountered, described the weighing practice in her published writings with the controlled anger that characterized her most effective advocacy. She wrote, "There exists in certain households a practice of weighing servants at regular intervals, ostensibly to prevent the consumption of provisions beyond the servant's authorized allocation. The practical effect of this practice is to subject a population already inadequately provisioned to a system of surveillance that treats their hunger as a disciplinary problem and their bodies as assets to be maintained at minimum cost. That it produces in the women subjected to it a quality of demoralization that I have observed directly, and that no quantity of adequate food could quickly reverse, seems not to have been considered by the households that employ it. A quality of demoralization that no quantity of adequate food could quickly reverse." She was describing the psychological damage as distinct from and in addition to the physical one. The weighing had done something that could not be fixed simply by feeding the women more. It had restructured their relationship with their own bodies and their own hunger in a way that persisted after the practice ended. Charles Booth, in his survey of London poverty, documented testimonies from former servants that describe the weighing practice with a specificity that suggests he encountered it frequently enough to consider it a systematic phenomenon rather than an individual eccentricity. One testimony he recorded from a former cook who had served in a household that weighed its servants fortnightly, described the practice with a vividness that Booth evidently considered worth preserving in full. The woman said, "I stood on that scale every other Monday for 4 years. I never gained enough weight for the housekeeper to speak to me. I was careful because I had seen what happened when she did. But standing on it every time was a reminder that my body was being watched, that every mouthful I had eaten since the last weighing was being counted, in a way, by the scale. That if I had eaten too much, though too much was nothing, just a little more than the nothing I was given, there would be consequences. I dreamed about the scale. I still do sometimes. I haven't been in service for 11 years, and I still dream about standing on a scale in a uniform while someone writes down my weight. 11 years out of service, still dreaming about the scale. The weighing practice had outlasted the household in this woman's nervous system. It had become a permanent feature of her psychological landscape, not a memory that faded with time, but a presence that the years had not dissolved. 11 years out of service, still dreaming about the scale. If that line is sitting with you, if the idea of a woman dreaming about a weighing scale 11 years after she left the household that put her on it is staying with you, leave a comment below. Tell me what part of tonight's documentary stayed with you the most. The ledger columns, Ellen's £19, Agnes's difficult disposition, the woman who still dreams about the scale. Your comments are what keeps this channel finding these stories. Subscribe to The Gilded Trace if you haven't already, because what comes next is the part of this story that I find the most extraordinary of all, not the practice itself. What happened when people finally said, this has to stop. The weighing practice did not end dramatically. There was no single moment of public exposure, no parliamentary inquiry, no criminal prosecution that brought it to a halt. It faded the way many of the most damaging practices of Victorian domestic service faded, through the slow accumulation of cultural pressure, economic change, and the gradual shift in what employers and employees believed was acceptable within the employment relationship. The cultural pressure came from reformers like Twining and investigators like Booth, whose documentation of the practice contributed to a broader, slowly building critique of Victorian domestic service conditions that became increasingly difficult to ignore as the century progressed. The economic pressure came from the tightening of the servant market that we have discussed in previous documentaries. As factory work and shop work expanded to offer working-class women alternatives to domestic service, the households that maintained the most oppressive conditions found themselves struggling to recruit and retain staff. A household known for weighing its servants was a household that working-class women, when they had alternatives, did not choose. Word travelled, not through newspapers or public campaigns, but through the network of communication that existed among working-class women, the connections between servants in different households, the intelligence passed between the women at the hiring fair, the warnings communicated in the letters that servants wrote to sisters and cousins and friends still in their home villages. This household weighs its servants. The warning was specific enough to be actionable and serious enough to be heeded. And the households that weighed their servants found over time that the practice cost them in ways that the household accounts, which recorded the money saved on reduced bread allocations, did not capture. They lost servants faster. They recruited from a narrowing pool. The servants they managed to recruit were increasingly the servants with the fewest alternatives, the most desperate, the least experienced, the ones who had not yet heard or could not afford to act on the warnings. And the servants with the fewest alternatives were, by the documented pattern of the Victorian servant market, the servants who produced the worst outcomes for the households that employed them. The arithmetic finally turned against the practice, not because Thomas Hughes and the men like him had a moral awakening, because the practice stopped working economically. The Hughes household ledgers end in 1886. There are no weight columns in the final pages. The household continued to operate. Other records show it functioning through the 1890s. But the monthly weighing appears to have stopped. We do not know exactly when or why. We do not know whether Hughes made a decision, or whether the housekeeper simply stopped recording, or whether the practice faded gradually as the servant who maintained the ledger with such precision retired or left. We know only that it stopped, that the columns end, that after 12 years of monthly weighings the numbers stop appearing. Ellen Marsh was long gone by then. She had left in 1882, 7 stone and 9 pounds, 25 years old, with a reference that did not mention the weight columns and a body that carried, in ways no reference could record, 12 years of the household's management. The Hughes household ledger is extraordinarily complete. It records, across 3 volumes and 12 years, almost everything that happened in the management of that Belgravia establishment. It records the wages paid to each servant, the allocation of coal and candles, the household's food purchases in quantities and prices that allow a precise reconstruction of what passed through the kitchen, the reference notes for servants hired, and the dismissal notes for servants who left. And it records the weights every first Monday of the month. Every servant. Every number compared to the previous number annotated when it moved in the wrong direction. 12 years of data. What the ledger cannot record, what no ledger of its kind was designed to record, what the entire apparatus of Victorian household management was structured specifically to exclude, is what the numbers meant to the people they described. It cannot record what Ellen Marsh felt when she stepped onto the scale in February 1879 and learned that 4 ounces of weight gain had cost her 1/3 of her bread allocation. It cannot record what Agnes felt standing on the scale every Monday for 4 years, measuring her body against a threshold she had not set and dreaming about the scale for 11 years afterward. It cannot record the specific quality of the housekeeper's look that Agnes described, the look that came before the number was written down, that communicated before any words were spoken whether the consultation was coming. It cannot record the 1144 mornings that Ellen Marsh woke in the Hughes household and began her day in a body that was, in Thomas Hughes's accounting system, a reliable indirect measure of consumption. It cannot record what it cost her to maintain for 6 years the particular quality of composure that the household required of its servants, the pressed against walls and the eyes down, and the silence in the face of the weighing that reduced her allocation and called the reduction a dietary consultation. It cannot record any of this, but we can. Ellen Marsh stepped onto that scale every first Monday of every month for 6 years. She arrived weighing 9 stone and 4 pounds. She left weighing 7 stone and 9 pounds. She was 25 years old. The scale measured her. Tonight we measure something else. We measure what was done to her. We measure what the ledger recorded and what it didn't. We measure the distance between the numbers in the columns and the person those numbers described, and we find that the distance is exactly the distance this series has been documenting since the beginning, the distance between what Victorian service required of people and what it was willing to acknowledge those people were. The platform scale in the corridor of Thomas Hughes's Belgravia household was moved to the laundry after 1886, when the weight columns stopped appearing in the ledger. It was used for linen. The purpose for which it had presumably been acquired before, it was repurposed as a management instrument for the bodies of the women who worked nearby. The laundry scale, restored to its original purpose, measuring sheets and tablecloths and pillow covers with the same indifferent precision it had applied for 12 years to the women who washed them. The ledger is in an archive. The 3 volumes in the housekeeper's careful hand, preserved because someone understood that they represented something worth preserving. Not because they documented the weighing of servants, because they documented the management of a Victorian household in extraordinary detail, and the weighing of servants was, in this context, simply one of many things the ledger recorded. It was not the reason it was preserved. It became, when the researcher found it, the most important thing it contained. Ellen Marsh, Agnes of the Charity Caseworkers' Notes, the 47 annotated reviews of provisions in the Manchester household, the woman who dreamed about the scale for 11 years. They stood on that scale and they were measured, and they were found, in the household's accounting system, to be consuming too much. The food they were consuming too much of was bread and tea and the occasional cold potato, and the reused tea leaves stretched past the point of any flavor, the scraps and the remnants, and the minimum that the hierarchy's leavings provided after the family and the upper servants had taken their portions. This was too much. The household measured it. The household reduced it. The household recorded the reduction in the ledger as a dietary consultation and moved to the next entry. Ellen Marsh arrived at 9 stone and 4 pounds and left at 7 stone and 9 pounds and was 25 years old and had been found repeatedly across 6 years to be consuming too much. Too much. In a house full of food, she could not eat. Tonight, the Gilded Trace does not have a scale. We have a ledger. And we have a story. And we have the particular kind of anger that comes from reading 3 volumes of a Victorian household management document and understanding entry by entry what the numbers in the weight columns meant to the people they described. Ellen Marsh, Agnes, the 47 women in the Manchester household, the woman who still dreamed about the scale. They were weighed. Tonight, we weighed something back. This has been the Gilded Trace, and tonight, we remembered them. Thank you for being here tonight. If Ellen Marsh stayed with you, if the ledger and the scale and the dietary consultation for 4 ounces stayed with you, and please leave a comment below. Tell me what hit hardest, the numbers in the columns, the woman who dreamed about the scale for 11 years, the moment you understood what dietary consultation actually meant. Subscribe to the Gilded Trace if you haven't already. We are not finished. There are more ledgers, more names, more stories that Victorian England recorded without understanding what it was recording. The next one is coming very soon. Until then, stay with us.
When we hear about the Middle Ages, images of knightly tournaments, majestic castles, and royal intrigues often come to mind. But all this splendor is only a small part of the story. In fact, most people in that era lived very differently. Their world was limited to the boundaries of their village, and their lives were filled with completely different concerns. We are used to thinking that life in a medieval village was primitive and monotonous, and its inhabitants were ignorant and superstitious. However, modern research and archaeological excavations reveal a much more complex and interesting picture.
Did you hear about the new harvest?
Oh, tell me everything.
They show that the medieval village was not just a cluster of houses, but a complex, well-organized system where everyone knew their place and their role. We will examine the most common misconceptions about life in a medieval village, based on historical facts and evidence. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn how people actually built their homes, cared for themselves and their loved ones, entertained themselves, and managed their households using knowledge and skills that we still consider ingenious today. Social structure and communication in a medieval English village were a complex web of duties, statuses, and relationships. At the top of this hierarchy was the lord of the manor, who owned the land. The peasants living on this land were divided into several groups. The most numerous were the villeins who were tied to the land and obliged to work for the Lord, performing corvée labor and paying taxes. Lower in status were the cotters, who owned smaller plots of land and often worked as hired laborers. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the serfs, who were completely dependent on the Lord and had virtually no rights. This system of relations was the basis of the entire rural society. Despite the strict hierarchy, life in the village was full of communication. The church was the center of social life. People gathered here not only for worship, but also to discuss news, resolve disputes, and organize celebrations. The entire community, from the Lord to the serf, met here as equals before God. Another important place for socializing was the tavern. Here you could drink ale, listen to travelers' stories, and exchange gossip. It was a place where social barriers were broken down and anyone could freely express their opinion. The village community was closely knit by family ties and neighborly relations. People helped each other with fieldwork, cared for the sick, and supported each other in times of grief. Collective labor, for example, on communal fields, strengthened the sense of unity and interdependence. However, communication was not limited to the village. As mentioned, residents regularly traveled to cities where they interacted with merchants, craftsmen, and townspeople. These were important channels for exchanging information and ideas, which helped the village remain part of the wider world. In addition to trade, cultural exchange took place through traveling minstrels, jugglers, and storytellers who brought entertainment and new stories to the villages. They not only entertained, but also passed on oral traditions, heroic sagas, and news from distant lands. These performances often brought the entire village together, creating a sense of community and shared experience. Village life was filled with rituals and celebrations that brought people together. The changing seasons were marked by special ceremonies, and church holidays such as Christmas and Easter were accompanied by mass festivities. Interaction within the village was based on unwritten rules and traditions that were passed down from generation to generation. Disputes were resolved at village meetings, where the elders and the village head made decisions. It was a kind of local court that ensured order and justice. However, despite all these mechanisms, conflicts were inevitable. They could arise from disputes over land, debts, or personal grievances. Community life required a constant search for compromise and the ability to live in a close-knit circle.
No, it is not.
Now, stop this foolishness.
Economic activity was directly linked to social interaction. Peasants joined together to perform collective work, such as plowing and sowing. Each member of the community played their part, and the well-being of all depended on the labor of each. Gradually, with the development of trade, villages became more open to the outside world. New goods and ideas began to penetrate rural life, changing its way of life. This process was slow but steady, and it eventually led to the destruction of the traditional hierarchical system. Life in a medieval village was a complex, multi-layered phenomenon, where economic, social, and cultural aspects were closely intertwined. Residents were part of a strict hierarchy, but at the same time found ways to communicate and express their individuality. The village was not just a place to survive, but a living organism with its own rules and traditions, where everyone knew their place and their role. What or who, in your opinion, was the most important commodity that the villagers sold at the market in the city? Share your thoughts in the comments. Although the feudal lord owned the land, the peasants had the right to use it, as well as to own their homes, tools, and crops. The peasants paid the feudal lord for the lease of the land, but they were its full users. They could pass it on by inheritance, and no one could take it away from them without good reason.
My lord, we have little to give.
Peasants also had their own gardens, where they grew vegetables and fruits for their own consumption. In addition, peasants had personal property, clothing, dishes, furniture, and tools. All these items were their property, and they could dispose of them as they saw fit. The remains of houses and household items found by archaeologists indicate that people had their own belongings, which they valued and passed down from generation to generation. The right to land was perhaps the most important aspect of a peasant's life. It determined his place in society, his status, and his well-being. Although peasants did not own land in the modern sense, their right to use it was protected by tradition and custom.
One day, all of this will be yours, my son.
It was not just the right to grow crops, but the right to exist. It was the basis for starting a family and passing on inheritance. Unlike modern land deals, which are regulated by complex documents, in medieval villages, this right was passed down from generation to generation and was common knowledge. The work of a peasant was not just a job, it was a way of life. It was closely connected with nature and the changing seasons. A peasant's day began at dawn and ended at sunset. The main tools were the plow, sickle, and scythe, and the main crops were wheat, barley, and oats. Fieldwork often required collective effort, which strengthened the community. Neighbors helped each other with sowing, harvesting, and other heavy work, creating strong social bonds. This collective labor was not only economically efficient, but also brought people together, helping them cope with difficulties. In addition to working on the Lord's fields, peasants had the right to work on their own land. This land was their main source of livelihood. Everything he grew on it belonged to him. This gave the peasant an incentive to work hard, as he knew that his labor would benefit him and his family. However, his work was not limited to agriculture. Peasants often engaged in other crafts. They wove baskets, repaired tools, and made wooden utensils. These skills were not only useful in everyday life, but also allowed peasants to earn extra money by selling their products at the market. The system of corvée, compulsory labor on the Lord's land, and rent, payment in cash or kind, was the basis of economic relations. Corvée could last several days a week and was strictly regulated. In addition, peasants had to pay various fees, for example, for using the Lord's mill, or for the right to graze livestock on communal pastures. These payments were a heavy burden, but they were part of a traditional system that ensured order and stability. At the same time, they restricted the freedom of peasants and their ability to accumulate wealth. Despite all the restrictions, peasants enjoyed a certain degree of economic independence. They could sell their surplus crops or their products at the market, which gave them access to goods they could not produce themselves. This, in turn, contributed to the development of trade and the growth of cities. Gradually, with the growth of commodity money relations, peasants began to pay their taxes in money rather than labor, which made them freer and more independent from their lords. This process was slow but steady and led to the gradual erosion of the feudal system. The right to property and labor in the medieval village were closely linked. They determined not only economic relations but also the social structure of society. Peasants who worked their own land and owned their own tools were an integral part of this system. Their labor was the foundation of the entire society, and their right to property, albeit limited, was the key to their survival. In a world where everything from land contracts to family histories was passed down by word of mouth, how would we learn about our rights? How would we preserve our history without the ability to write it down? We'll talk about this very soon. Contrary to popular belief, the inhabitants of medieval villages were not entirely illiterate. Although literacy rates were low, they were much higher than we tend to think. There were schools in villages where people were taught to read and write. Of course, they were not like modern schools, but they gave people the basic knowledge they needed to run their households and trade. Many peasants could keep records and count. Tablets found by archaeologists with records of debts and transactions show that people used writing in their daily lives. In addition, there were people in villages who were more educated than the rest. These were elders, priests, and scribes who helped people with documents and accounts. Education in medieval villages was closely linked to the church. The church was not only responsible for spiritual life, but was also the center of education and knowledge preservation. Priests were often the only literate people in the village and acted as teachers, passing on basic knowledge of reading, writing, and arithmetic. In some villages, there were small schools attached to churches where children, mainly boys from wealthier families, could receive primary education. These schools provided practical skills necessary for farming and participating in local government. Literacy in the Middle Ages was mainly functional. People learned to read and write not for pleasure or self-improvement, but to solve specific problems. Peasants engaged in trade had to be able to keep track of their goods and debts. Scribes and village elders were indispensable for drawing up contracts, court records, and tax documents. They were a kind of notary and lawyer whose knowledge ensured order and justice in society. For peasants who could not write, these people were a bridge to a wider world where rules and laws existed in written form. Writing also played an important role in everyday life. Archaeological finds such as wax tablets and wooden tags show that peasants used them to keep records of transactions, debts, and family events. These simple records were their personal history, their financial documents, and legal evidence. They were proof that literacy was not the exclusive prerogative of the elite, but was part of the lives of ordinary people. This allows us to rethink our view of medieval peasants as completely illiterate and uneducated people. In addition to the church and rural schools, there were other ways to acquire knowledge. Some peasants could learn to read and write from their more educated neighbors or relatives. Craftsmen, especially those who traded with towns, also needed basic reading and arithmetic skills. Literacy was not only a sign of high status, but also a tool for survival and prosperity. It gave peasants the opportunity to defend their rights, trade, and participate in community life on an equal footing with others. Despite the presence of literate people, the majority of the population remained illiterate. This created certain difficulties. The transmission of information depended on the spoken word, which made it vulnerable to distortion and error. Oral contracts and agreements could be forgotten or interpreted differently, leading to conflicts. In such conditions, the role of literate people in the village was invaluable. They were the keepers of knowledge and intermediaries between the illiterate majority and the written world of the feudal elite. The level of literacy in medieval villages was certainly lower than in cities, but it was sufficient to sustain society. It showed that even under the feudal system, people sought knowledge and used writing in their daily lives. This was not just the ability to read and write, but the ability to survive and thrive in a world that was gradually changing. Although living conditions were far from ideal, people took measures to maintain cleanliness. Villages had public baths where people washed and socialized. Water was available from rivers and wells, and people used it for washing and laundry. Archaeological excavations at former village sites have uncovered the remains of baths and soap made from animal fats and ash. As for clothing, it was washed and dirty clothes were replaced with clean ones. Of course, this was not as frequent as it is today, but it was done. Hygiene habits in medieval villages were determined by the availability of resources and traditions. Although daily showers were impossible, people kept themselves as clean as possible. Washing hands and face was a common practice, especially before meals and after working in the fields. Public baths were an important part of social life, where people not only washed but also exchanged news and gossip. These baths were often simple wooden structures with stone ovens where water was heated, and they were a place for socializing and relaxing after a hard day's work. Primitive soap made from animal fats, such as pork or beef, and wood ash was used for washing. This process was laborious, but the result was effective. Soap not only cleansed the skin, but also helped to combat insects and parasites, which were a common problem in the Middle Ages. In addition to soap, Various herbs and infusions with antiseptic and aromatic properties were used to cleanse the body. For example, mint and rosemary were often added to water for washing. Dental care was also part of hygiene, albeit in a primitive form. People used twigs and herbs to clean their teeth and gums. Plants with abrasive properties were particularly valued for their ability to remove plaque and food debris. Despite the lack of modern amenities, people strove to maintain oral hygiene to avoid disease and unpleasant odors. In addition, toothache was one of the most common problems and was treated with herbs, infusions, and even cauterization. Clothing also played an important role in maintaining cleanliness. Peasants wore simple clothes made of linen, hemp, or coarse wool. It was practical and durable, but it had to be washed regularly, which was no easy task. Water from rivers and wells was used for washing, as well as lye obtained from ash. Clothes were washed by hand, beating them on stones or using special boards. Despite all efforts, clothes were rarely perfectly clean, but people tried to keep them in good condition to avoid disease. Personal hygiene was closely linked to health. People intuitively understood that cleanliness helped prevent disease and tried to follow these principles. However, a lack of knowledge about germs and unsanitary living conditions in general limited their efforts. Diseases caused by poor hygiene were common, but people believed that they could be prevented through cleanliness and proper nutrition. Thus, it can be said that medieval people paid attention to hygiene as much as possible under their circumstances. They used the means and methods available to them to keep their bodies, clothes, and homes clean. This was not simply a desire for comfort, but a necessity for survival in a world where disease and unsanitary conditions were a constant threat. Now that we have established that medieval people were not as dirty as we might think, another equally important question arises. What did they eat to avoid smelling like they hadn't washed? Let's talk about that right now. The diet of medieval peasants was quite varied, and they ate many different foods. Grains were the staple of their diet: barley, rye, and oats. These were used to bake bread and make porridge and soups. But besides grains, people actively used other foods as well. They grew cabbage, onions, garlic, beans, and peas in their gardens. Meat was part of the diet, although not every day. People raised pigs, chickens, geese, and cows. Fish was also an important part of the diet, especially during fasting days. In addition, people gathered wild herbs, berries, and mushrooms. Bread was the staple food, often coarsely ground and mixed with bran and even seeds. It was the main source of calories and energy and was eaten with every meal. Bread could be baked in a communal oven, which was the center of village life, or at home if the farmer had his own oven. In addition to bread, grains were used to make porridge and soups, which were simple but nutritious dishes. These dishes were often cooked with vegetables, herbs, and, if lucky, pieces of meat. Vegetables were an important part of the diet because they were easily available and could be grown in one's own garden. Cabbage, onions, garlic, peas, and beans were the most common. They not only added flavor, but were also a source of vitamins and minerals. For example, garlic and onions had antiseptic properties, while beans and peas were an important source of protein, especially on fasting days when meat was forbidden. Meat was more of a luxury than a daily dish. Its consumption depended on social status and the season. Pork was the most popular type of meat, as pigs were easy to raise and could feed on scraps. Chickens and geese were also raised, providing not only meat but also eggs. Cows were valued primarily for their milk, butter, and cheese, and meat was only slaughtered in cases of extreme necessity, such as in late autumn to prepare for winter. Meat was often salted or smoked to preserve it for long periods of time. Fish was a vital part of the diet, especially during fasting days when the church forbade the consumption of meat. Peasants living near rivers and lakes caught fish and ate it fresh or dried. In drier areas, people ate salted and dried fish, which was an important commodity in trade. Fishing was not only a means of obtaining food, but also an important occupation for many peasants. Wild foods such as berries, mushrooms, and herbs supplemented the diet, especially in summer and autumn. Gathering these foods was part of everyday life and helped peasants survive in difficult times. Berries were used to make compotes and jams, and herbs were used to make medicines and infusions. This variety of foods made the medieval peasant diet more balanced than we tend to think, and helped them get the nutrients they needed. Beer and ale were the main beverages, as water from rivers and wells was often contaminated. Beer was low in alcohol, even children drank it, and it was an important source of calories. Ale was brewed from barley and was an integral part of every meal. It was a safe and nutritious drink that not only quenched thirst, but was also part of social life. Thus, the diet of medieval peasants was simple but functional. It was based on local products that were available in the village and varied according to the season and religious holidays. Despite all the difficulties, people found ways to provide themselves and their families with the necessary nutrition. They used all available resources and knowledge to survive and thrive. Life in a medieval village was not boring or monotonous. People had many forms of entertainment and knew how to spend their time usefully. Villages held celebrations, fairs, and festivals, which were times for fun and socializing. People played games, danced, and sang. They had their own songs and stories, which they passed down from generation to generation. In addition, there were other forms of entertainment. For example, people played chess, backgammon, and other board games. They also participated in sports such as wrestling, archery, and others. Leisure time in a medieval village was closely tied to the calendar. Religious holidays such as Christmas, Easter, and Shrovetide were the main occasions for mass celebrations.
My love, she walked through fields so green.
On these days, peasants were freed from hard work and gathered together to sing, dance, and participate in theatrical performances based on biblical stories. These holidays brought the community together and helped people forget about the hardships of everyday life. Fairs and festivals were another important part of leisure time. They took place several times a year and attracted people from surrounding villages and towns. Fairs were not only a place for trade, but also for entertainment. Street performers, jugglers, acrobats, and minstrels performed here, bringing news and stories from distant lands. These events were a window to the wider world and helped people broaden their horizons. Games were also a popular way to pass the time. Board games, such as chess and backgammon, were popular among all classes of society, although they were perhaps less sophisticated in villages. Checkers, or mill, and other simple games played on boards drawn on the ground were accessible to everyone. These games developed logic and strategic thinking and served as a good way to socialize. Sport was an integral part of life. Men competed in wrestling and archery, which helped them stay in shape and prepare for possible military conflicts. These competitions were often accompanied by betting and were the subject of heated debates. Football, in its primitive form, was also popular, although it was more like a mass brawl than a modern sport and often ended in injuries. Stories and songs were the main means of transmitting knowledge and traditions. In the evenings, when work was finished, families gathered around the hearth, and elders told legends, myths, and stories about their ancestors.
Cut with the wind, cut with the grain, every stroke a harvest gain.
These stories were not only entertainment, but also a way to preserve history and culture. The songs sung at festivals and in the fields reflected the life, joys, and sorrows of the medieval peasant. Work was also part of leisure, although this may seem strange. Working together, for example, in communal fields or building a house, was often accompanied by songs and jokes. This made hard work easier and more enjoyable, and also strengthened the community spirit. People did not separate work and leisure as strictly as we do today. Thus, life in a medieval village was filled with simple but meaningful entertainment. People found joy in socializing, games, and celebrations, which helped them forget their hardships. These forms of leisure were an integral part of their culture and were important for maintaining the social structure. After all the dancing and fun, Who had the right to decide when the party was over? And how much could this eternal spoiler influence the life of every peasant? Stay with us. We'll tell you all about it right now. The feudal lord's power over the peasants was not absolute. Although the feudal lord did have a lot of power, the peasants had their own rights and responsibilities, which were enshrined in law. They could complain about the feudal lord to the court, and even take him to court. Peasants were also free to move around and even leave the village if they were dissatisfied with their conditions. Of course, this was not easy, but it was possible. The feudal system was based on the relationship between the lord of the manor, feudal lord, and his peasants. The lord owned the land and gave it to the peasants to use, and in return received their labor, taxes, and loyalty. This was not just a contract, but a complex network of obligations and rights enshrined in traditions and customs. The lord was not only a landowner, but also a judge and protector. He was responsible for maintaining order, resolving disputes, and defending the village from external threats. However, his power was limited by customary law and traditions that were known and respected by all. Although peasants depended on the lord, they were not his slaves. They had certain rights that were protected by law. For example, they had the right to use the land, pass it on to their heirs, and even sell their right to use it. This gave them a certain degree of economic independence. In the event of unfair treatment by the lord, peasants could take him to the manorial court, where their case would be heard. This court was made up of peasants, which gave them the opportunity to influence decisions. It was an important mechanism that protected peasants from arbitrary rule. The manorial court was the heart of self-government in the village. It met regularly to resolve disputes, hear crimes, and keep order. The court dealt with cases involving debts, land disputes, theft, and other offenses.
I demand recompense for the damages to my harvest.
The peasants who sat on the court were familiar with local traditions and customs, which made their decisions fair and understandable to everyone. Although the lord or his representative presided over the court, his power was limited, and he could not make decisions alone. This was an important element that gave the peasants a certain amount of power. Contrary to popular belief, many peasants were not tied to the land. They could leave the village if they wanted to, although it was not easy. To do so, they had to obtain permission from the lord and pay a certain fee. Many moved to the cities, where they sought a better life and became craftsmen or merchants. This process was an important factor in the growth of cities and the development of the economy. It was also a kind of leverage over the lord, who, in order to keep his peasants, had to provide them with acceptable conditions. The church also played an important role in limiting the power of the feudal lord. It protected peasants from arbitrary rule and could speak out on their behalf. Church holidays and customs were part of village life, and the lord could not ignore them. The church was also a major landowner, and many peasants worked for it rather than for the secular feudal lord. This created an alternative that gave peasants more freedom. Thus, the power of the feudal lord in the medieval village was a complex phenomenon. It was based not only on force and land ownership, but also on traditions, customs, and laws. The peasants, although subordinate, had their own rights and duties, which they defended. They could complain about their lord, participate in court proceedings, and even leave the village. All these factors made their lives more complicated than we tend to think, and showed that even under feudalism, people had a certain degree of freedom. The houses of medieval peasants were not just shelters from the weather, but real fortresses, built from available materials and designed to withstand the harsh realities of life. Their architecture reflected not only the climatic conditions, but also the social status of the owner and community traditions. Depending on the region, a wide variety of materials were used for construction. In northern England, where there were many forests, houses were often built from an oak frame filled with wattle and daub. This method was simple and effective. The oak beam frame provided a solid foundation, and the space between the beams was filled with interwoven branches, wattle, which were then coated with a mixture of clay, straw, and manure. This provided good insulation and protection from the wind. In regions with an abundance of stone, such as Scotland and Wales, houses were built from unworked stones held together with clay mortar. A typical peasant house consisted of 1 or 2 rooms. The main room, or hall, was the center of all life. Here people cooked, ate, slept, and received guests. Simple wooden benches and tables usually stood along the walls. The floor was earthen, covered with the straw or reeds, which were periodically replaced. In the center of the hall was a hearth, which was not only a source of heat, but also the main place for cooking. Smoke from the hearth rose to an opening in the roof or escaped through a small window, although this often made the room smoky. Roofs were one of the most important elements of a house, as they provided protection from rain and snow. They were most often covered with a thick layer of straw or reeds, which provided excellent heat and water insulation. A thatched roof was easy to make and inexpensive, but it had to be replaced regularly as it wore out quickly. Wealthy farmers could afford tiles or wooden shingles, which were more durable but also more expensive. Farm buildings were often located next to the residential house. A barn for livestock, a pigsty, a chicken coop, and a cow shed. All of them were built according to the same principle as the residential house. These buildings were an integral part of the peasant economy and were used to store crops, keep livestock, and protect against the weather. Sometimes the cattle shed was attached to the house, and the heat from the animals helped to warm the living quarters. The architecture of rural houses was not merely functional, it was imbued with symbolism. The house was a symbol of the family and the clan. It was built according to tradition, and every element, from its orientation to the cardinal points to the location of the hearth, had its own meaning. The peasant house was a fortress that protected against the outside world, and a place where knowledge and traditions were passed down from generation to generation. Medieval houses, although simple, were very practical. In northern countries, where winters were cold, houses were built of thick logs or stone, which retained heat well. In warmer regions, wood and clay were used, which were also effective. Houses had fireplaces and hearths, which were not only used for cooking, but also for heating the room. Smoke from the fire escaped through special openings in the roof, which helped to prevent suffocation. Medieval peasants were not primitive farmers. In the Middle Ages, important discoveries were made in agriculture that led to increased crop yields and improved people's lives. One of the important discoveries was the plow. It allowed the land to be cultivated more efficiently. People also used a 3-field crop rotation system, which allowed the land to rest and recover. This increased yields and helped prevent famine. The development of agriculture in the Middle Ages was a key factor that led to population growth and the growth of cities. The invention and widespread use of the heavy-wheeled plow was a real revolution. Whereas peasants had previously used light wooden plows that only scratched the surface of the soil, the new plow with an iron plowshare could plow the soil deeply, making it more fertile. This made it possible to cultivate the heavy clay soils of Northern Europe, which had previously been considered unsuitable for agriculture. The 3-field crop rotation system was another ingenious innovation. It replaced the old 2-field system, which was less efficient. Under the 2-field system, half of the land was left fallow each year to restore fertility. In the 3-field system, the field was divided into 3 parts. One was sown with winter crops, such as rye. The second was spring crops, such as oats or beans. And the third was left fallow. This allowed 2/3 of the land to be used instead of 1/2, which significantly increased yields and provided a more varied diet. The use of horses instead of oxen for plowing also played an important role. Horses were faster and stronger than oxen, which allowed large areas of land to be cultivated in less time. The invention of a new harness that did not choke the animal made their use even more efficient. Horses allowed farmers to work faster, freeing up time for other activities. Thus, medieval peasants were not simply primitive farmers. They were part of a dynamic system that was constantly evolving. New technologies and social changes, such as the plow, the 3-field system, and horses, allowed them to increase their yields, improve their lives, and prepare the ground for future changes. Medieval people cared about their health. In the Middle Ages, there were doctors who possessed deep knowledge and skills. In villages, there were healers and herbalists who treated people with herbs and other remedies. In cities, there were doctors who were educated at universities. They knew how to treat diseases and perform operations. Healthcare in medieval villages was a complex mix of traditional knowledge, superstition, and limited medical practice. Unlike modern doctors, who rely on scientific methods, medieval healers used knowledge passed down from generation to generation. Healers and herbalists were the main doctors in rural areas. They possessed extensive knowledge of medicinal herbs and their properties. They gathered plants and used them to make decoctions, infusions, and ointments to treat various ailments. Their knowledge was invaluable, as they were the only source of medical care for most of the population. In cities, on the other hand, medical practice was more advanced. Doctors educated at universities such as Paris, Bologna, or Oxford relied on the works of ancient Roman and Greek physicians such as Galen and Hippocrates. They possessed diagnostic skills and could perform complex operations, including amputations and trepanation of the skull. However, their services were only available to wealthy people, and ordinary peasants could not afford them. Medical theories at the time were based on the idea of humors. 4 fluids in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose imbalance was believed to cause disease. Treatment was aimed at restoring this balance. Doctors used bloodletting, cauterization, and diet to return the body to its normal state. Although these methods may seem primitive to us, they were based on centuries of observation and experience. Most diseases were treated with diet, medicinal herbs, and hygiene. People intuitively understood that cleanliness helped prevent disease and tried to maintain it as much as possible.
May your spirit be healed.
However, in the absence of knowledge about germs and unsanitary conditions, even the simplest wounds could lead to serious infections. Therefore, when an illness was too serious, people turned to the church, which was considered the last resort and source of healing. Despite all the limitations, medieval medicine was part of a vibrant and evolving society. The knowledge and skills of doctors and herbalists were passed down from generation to generation, and new discoveries and treatments gradually became part of everyday practice. It was a world where people fought for survival using all the means and knowledge available to them. We have looked at the most popular misconceptions about life in a medieval English village and found that many of them have nothing to do with reality. Archaeology and historical documents have helped us recreate a more accurate and complete picture of this era. We have learned that people were cleaner, more educated, and more inventive than we thought. What other facts about the Middle Ages would you like to learn? Suggest topics for our future videos in the comments. Also, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our new releases.
What topic shall we delve into next?